For the last few months, much of the fighting in Ukraine has been centered around Bakhmut, a small town in Donbass with a pre-war population of about 70,000 people. Now, for most of the war, the front lines around Bakhmut were relatively stable, but in the last couple of months or so, the Russians have made steady progress to the north and south, and Bakhmut is now at serious risk of encirclement. And despite the Pentagon advising Kyiv to retreat, there are still thousands of Ukrainian troops in the town. So it looks like the stage is set for a bloody showdown. In this video, we're going to take a look at what's happened over the last few weeks, why the Ukrainians have refused to retreat, and what this means for the wider trajectory of the war. Before we get into the most recent developments, a quick recap. After the Russians took the towns of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in July of last year, they started moving west towards the last few remaining Ukrainian holdouts in Donbass, most notably Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, each with a pre-war population of about 100,000 people. The Kremlin made it clear that they considered the capture of Donbass a strategic priority, largely because Putin had recognized the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. And as such, they committed a significant number of troops to the effort, including tens of thousands of Wagner mercenaries. Having ceded Lysychansk, Ukrainian forces regrouped in Bakhmut, a smaller town that lies about 30 kilometers east of Kramatorsk, presumably because they realized that the Russians would be unable to take Sloviansk or Kramatorsk without taking Bakhmut first. That's because all major roads in the area run through Bakhmut. So unless the Russians were to trek through a load of muddy fields, they were always going to have to take Bakhmut before Sloviansk or Kramatorsk. However, given the number of troops involved, the Russians probably expected to take Bakhmut relatively quickly. But that's not how things have played out. And for nearly 6 months, the front lines have barely moved. So, in an attempt to overwhelm the Ukrainians and stop this stalemate, Wagner sent more and more troops into the town, including conscripts, in human wave attacks. In response, the Ukrainians sent more troops to the town themselves, leading to a casualty rate which earned the town the nickname the Meat Grinder. Eventually, though, it seems that this strategy paid dividends, because in mid-January, Wagner forces captured Soledar, a tiny town about 10 kilometers north of Bakhmut, with a pre-war population of about 10,000 people. Now, for context, there are basically 4 roads for the Ukrainians in and out of Bakhmut. The T0513 road, which runs north, the M03, which runs northwest to Sloviansk, the T0504, which runs southwest and then on to Kramatorsk, and the O0506, a smaller road which runs west. Now, by taking Soledar, Wagner were able to cut off the T0513 and put pressure on the M03, limiting Ukrainian supplies into Bakhmut. Then, by the end of January, Wagner made further progress around Soledar and took Klitschivka, a tiny settlement just south of Bakhmut. Now, it was around this time that the Pentagon allegedly started advising Ukraine to retreat from Bakhmut. But the Ukrainians apparently disagreed and instead committed even more troops to reinforce their positions. However, at the same time, the Russians were moving west towards Chastiv Yar and Ivaniskiv. Then, by mid-February, the Russians had made further progress around Soledar, and they were even on the outskirts of Ivaniskiv. This essentially meant that 3 of the 4 roads into Bakhmut were now within firing distance of Russian artillery, leaving the Ukrainians exclusively reliant on the O0506 and other dirt roads nearby. Now, this is clearly already a precarious situation, but things have got a fair bit worse over the last few days. That's because Wagner have made further progress from the north, moving south from Soledar into the outskirts of Bakhmut. And at the time of writing, there are reports that Russians are staging offensives towards Ivaniski. Clearly then, the Ukrainians in Bakhmut are at serious risk of encirclement. There's only one road left out of Bakhmut, and if Wagner continue to advance, they won't even have that available for all that much longer. In fact, the road is already within firing distance of most Russian artillery, and there were reports earlier this week that it was only usable at night. And as a result, even Ukrainian high command, who are usually pretty bullish on this sort of thing, have started sounding the alarm. In fact, for the last few months, Zelensky ended his nightly address with a triumphant Bakhmut holds. But on Tuesday, he admitted that Bakhmut's defense was becoming more and more difficult. And the commander of Ukraine's ground forces described the situation as extremely tense. Despite this, it doesn't look like the Ukrainians are retreating. There were signs that they were considering withdrawal early this month, when the Ukrainian army blew up a bridge in the town, and Zelensky said that forces won't hold the city at any cost, with everyone dying. But the last few days have seen conflicting reports, suggesting that the commander of Ukraine's ground forces has actually committed yet more troops to the town. No one knows the precise number right now, but most estimates suggest that there are at least a couple of thousand Ukrainian troops left in the city. So it would obviously be a humanitarian and strategic disaster if they were encircled by Wagner and the Russians. Which raises the question, why didn't the Ukrainians retreat earlier like the Pentagon suggested? After all, Bakhmut has essentially been reduced to rubble, so it doesn't really function as a logistics hub any longer. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't have any strategic value. It's still a necessary step for the Russians, and if they can take the hills surrounding Bakhmut, they might be able to put Sloviansk and Kramatorsk within range of their artillery. Nonetheless, in the grand scheme of things, it is just a small town, and the fact that it's taken the Russians 6 months and thousands of troops suggests that they won't be capturing Sloviansk or Kramatorsk, which are both bigger and better fortified than Bakhmut, anytime soon. So, given all this, why haven't the Ukrainians retreated? Well, it might be that the Ukrainians are trying to attrit Russian forces in the town, or perhaps they're trying to draw in Russian forces to launch a counteroffensive elsewhere, like the Svatov-Kremenna line or in Zaporizhia. It might also be more political than strategic anyway. As we mentioned a moment ago, Bakhmut has taken on immense symbolic value, often mentioned in Zelensky's nightly address, and is commonly referred to as the fortress of Bakhmut. So Kyiv might be worried that giving it up would dampen Ukrainian morale, and perhaps even Western enthusiasm for Ukraine, if it suddenly looks like Ukraine is losing the war. Whatever the motivation, it wouldn't be good for Ukraine if thousands of their troops were suddenly surrounded by Wagner, and Zelensky will probably have to decide whether or not they really want to retreat in the next couple of days, because ultimately, it doesn't look like the window of opportunity will be open all that much longer. But obviously, we'll have to wait and see how all this shakes out. But it's a worrying issue for Zelensky and for Ukrainian morale more generally. Regardless, if you want to be updated as it does play out, then be sure to subscribe to the TLDR Daily Briefing. Over there, we break down the biggest news story each day, before running you through 3 other stories that you might have missed in the day's chaos. That makes it the quickest and easiest way to stay on top of the news from around the world, and make it sound like you know what you're talking about. And because it's from TLDR, you know that the videos will be unbiased and easy to understand. You can find the show every weekday over on the TLDR Daily YouTube channel, or if you prefer, you can listen by searching in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for your support.